Let's go now to Olawale Ismail, who's a senior lecturer at the African Leadership Centre at King's College London. Really good to have you with us, Olawale. Can we start with the latest visits by some of the coup leaders to neighbouring countries? I mean, they're clearly looking to legitimise their rule over Niger. How are they being received in these countries?
Thank you. In the neighboring countries that have also had experiences of coups in the last year or so, they are building a new crop of pro-Russian regimes in the Sahel. So, and also the neighboring states have declared their support for the regime, and they have also issued a warning to ECOWAS against any military intervention. They actually told ECOWAS that any military action in Niger will be seen as a declaration of war against their own state, even though they have not been targets of ECOWAS military intervention as yet. So it's quite interesting to see that the regime is building alliances with likes mind, with regimes that are similar in their orientation, who have launched a coup, ousted a democratically elected regimes, and have, established closer ties with Russia.
Yes, and earlier today, we heard from one of the coup leaders, Abdurrahman Tiani, who made a televised address in Niger saying that the military junta would pave its way to a democracy in Niger. It didn't set a date for elections, but presumably that's the end goal here. I mean, how serious do you think the military junta in Niger is about this transition to democracy?
The military cannot be trusted under any circumstance. And like we say in West Africa, the worst civilian regime is better than the best military regime, we've had historically. Typically, that is usually the game plan. They will announce transition to election, but we've seen, as in neighboring countries, those transitions are quite elongated. Some will propose a 4-year transition, and in those 4 years, they will talk about a new constitution, they will talk about new national conciliation or truth healing, and the rest. So it's a textbook case, and that is always a way of finding a common ground with ECOWAS and the AU by promising transition back to democracy. The key challenge there is always in the devil is in the detail. They will want to propose many years of those transitions, while ECOWAS and the AU will either call for immediate return back to democracy or return within a matter of months. But as we've seen with neighboring countries, they would not accept or they will not agree with ECOWAS and EU for either a swift return or return within a year. They will usually propose a multi-year transition.
That's right, because we know ECOWAS has demanded a return to democracy within a week. I mean, that deadline has pretty much come and gone. But in terms of how ECOWAS has reacted, the threat of sanctions, and also the AU and other international blocs as well, I mean, how effective can they be in terms of persuading the junta to give up power? Because when you look at their recent threats at other coups in the region, they haven't really been successful, have they?
Yes, but the situation of each of the countries in question is quite different. I think of all the countries in question, Niger is the most dependent because one is landlocked. All the countries are landlocked, but I think Niger is even more landlocked and is one of the poorest countries in the world. I am aware that Nigeria has closed its borders with Niger, which is huge for Niger. Nigeria has switched off electricity supply to Niger. Nigeria supplies Niger all its electricity needs. So by the time you close the border, Niger, the economy of Niger relies on cross-border trade with Nigeria a lot, more than any other country. So that is going to affect Niger quite substantially. But within the broader scheme of things in terms of AU and ECOWAS sanctions, whether those sanctions will bite to the extent that it can force the military junta to hand over power immediately. I don't think so, partly because the regime will always survive. They have established close relations with Russia, and that could give them a lifeline in terms of access to new sources of aid and development assistance. But also, security assistance as well. But the case of Niger is a very careful one because you have huge French and American and as well as German security presence in that country, and it's such a huge country. So even a military adventure by ECOWAS, a military operation by ECOWAS, is always going to be a very, very distant, reality. Now is a space for negotiation, for diplomacy. This morning, a special mediation team led by former president of Nigeria, Abdulsalam Abubakar, arrived in Niger to negotiate with the regime. We'll see what the outcome of those negotiations are. We know that the president of Chad was there a few days ago. So there are quite a lot of behind the scenes conversations and negotiations with the regime. Whether the regime will budge or could budge is what is unknown at this point. But my gut feeling is that the regime will not hand over power immediately. So it will be a question of how long will the promised transition to democratic elections and democratic governance, how long it's going to be. That is what is going to be at stake at this point. But nonetheless, given the military presence of France in that country, and the fact that there is a convergence that the advent of coup needs to be stopped, I wouldn't take the military option off the table, especially if we understand what happened in the case of Senegal. Sorry, in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, some over 10 years ago, when France had to invade the presidential palace to remove the recalcitrant former president.
Yeah.
So we can't even take anything off the table at this point. But I think now is a time for diplomacy, and diplomacy is at work at this point.
Okay. Olawale Ismail, we'll have to leave it there. But thanks so much for sharing your analysis with us here on TRT World.